Now they do say better late than never, so with that in mind, welcome to our review of the PowerColor RX 5700 XT Red Devil. Now it's pretty good timing because we've just finished our review of the Sapphire Nitro Plus card. It's already gone back to Sapphire, but the reason it's good timing is that this card is very similar in size, very similar in features, and similar in price, so it's going to make a nice comparison point. So starting with the Red Devil card, we have a pretty large chunky boy. It's about 300mm long, it comes into triple slot, and it's also over 130mm tall, so make sure you've got room to house it. It's also well over a kilogram in weight, and the build quality is really rather good. We've got a really solid shroud on the top here, and a big metal backplate as well, although this doesn't get involved with the cooling. There are no pads connecting it to the PCB as far as I can tell, so something to bear in mind. Elsewhere, we can see there are 3 display ports and 1 HDMI on the rear I/O. Now this is a match for the reference card, but Sapphire was using 2 DisplayPort, 2 HDMI. I mean, really, which of those you prefer is up to you. It's probably not going to make a big difference for many people. But one cool thing on this card is that the ports illuminate red. So if you're kind of fiddling around in the dark trying to find a port, you don't have to get your phone out, shine a light. It should be nice and illuminated for you. Elsewhere, features match up with the Nitro Plus card as well. We've got a 0 RPM fan mode, so these fans will switch off under about 60 degrees Celsius. And we also get a dual BIOS switch, and you do get RGB lighting as well. So even though it's called the Red Devil, you can turn it into the Blue Devil, Green Devil, whatever color you want Devil. Now, unfortunately, I managed to snap the RGB cable, so I'm not sure if we're going to be able to show it properly in B-roll, but it is quite fetching. It's along here, along the top, including this little strip here, and also the backplate logo gets involved as well. Now, one difference regarding the lighting compared to Sapphire is that Sapphire gives you a pinout for controlling the lighting on your motherboard, but you do have to kind of mod the cables to it yourself. They don't give you any connectors or cables, so I don't really think it's a huge advantage, but something to think about. Another piece of good news is that PowerColor has confirmed that this card will have a 3-year warranty in the UK, which brings it up to speed with what we like to see from partners and is a match for Sapphire too. Now, we have seen some retailers saying 2 years, but we have it in writing from PowerColor that it is a 3-year warranty. Looking at the specs, we see that the clock speeds join Sapphire in being the fastest on paper, but remember these are just indicative of the many-state voltage frequency curve and not specific points on it. The actual frequency at any time depends on the quality of the individual GPU, the thermals, and the power consumption. On that note, PowerColor sets the GPU power limit to 220 watts, which means we're probably looking at a total board power of around 265 watts, as it's typically around 45 watt higher than the GPU-only figure. This again is a match for Sapphire. Supporting this hefty increase in power compared to reference is a pair of 8-pin PCIe plugs, but annoyingly these are not indented, so you need to account for cable height as well. You also get a dual BIOS switch with the positions helpfully labelled, allowing you to knock back the speeds and power consumption to roughly reference levels, which should reduce heat and noise. The memory is fixed at 14 gigabits per second in both modes, and so far we've not seen any cards that deviate from this. Just a quick look at the cooler before we start the teardown. We're looking at a triple 90mm fan setup, all fans spinning in the same direction and exhausting heat out of the top and bottom of the card for the most part. These fans do not have the quick disconnect feature that I was so fond of on the Sapphire, so if you ever need to replace them, it's going to be a bit of a more complicated process to get them out. They are held in by cables and multiple screws. It's only 6 screws holding the whole thing together, so we'll whip those out and show you what's going on. Just before I pull it apart, I want to also point out the holes in the backplate here. This is going to allow air to come directly through the card rather than getting trapped in the PCB area. So it's a pretty good design as well. There we go. So starting with the cooler, we can see a huge copper contact plate here, which has thermal paste to cool the GPU, and it also shares the cooling with the memory. So the memory pads, which are nice sizes as well, are connected directly to the same contact plate. Now this contact plate feeds 5 separate heat pipes, and these are running through 2 separate fin stacks. So a lot of metal being used and filling out the volume very nicely. PowerColor is also using a separate contact plate with pads to cool down the VRMs, and this is on the secondary heatsink. Now there are some slight differences compared to Sapphire. Sapphire was using a completely separate heatsink for the memory. There isn't really one better way to go about it. It really just depends on how you implement it. So we'll look at the thermals a little bit later. The only thing that you might say is working in Sapphire's favour is that they had a few more pads to take care of like some of the secondary MOSFETs and the IC itself, but these are pretty minor differences overall. Quick look at the PCB. As usual, we've got the GPU here, 8 GDDR6 memory packages here with the thermal pads on top, and PowerColor has upgraded from 7 power phases for the GPU on the reference design to 10 here, compared to 8 on the Sapphire Nitro Plus as well. Technically this should make it better, but it's not something that we're going to get too hung up on, to be honest. Over here is the fan connector, and over here is the where the RGB connector should be had I not pulled it off the board. There is no significant difference in terms of boost behavior between the PowerColor Red Devil and the Sapphire Nitro Plus running their default overclocked BIOS, which is no surprise given the similar size of their coolers and identical GPU power targets. Both average comfortably above 1900 MHz and are effectively the joint fastest cards we've seen so far, and neither show signs of thermally induced downclocking. The PowerColor Silent BIOS is more conservative than Sapphire's, though again this isn't surprising given that it has a 15 watt lower power target. Its boost frequency is below that of the reference card however, which is arguably not ideal since this performance should act as a baseline for partners. These differences are borne out nicely by 3D Mark since it is so granular a benchmark. There's no real difference at the top, but the conservative Silent BIOS is a little under 2% slower than the reference card. We're going to rush through a few games now, as usual limiting ourselves to a selection of 1440p tests. The full set of results including more games and 1080p is available on the website. There's extremely little tangible difference between the various partner cards, each adding a few percent to the reference performance. For this card, it's 4% overall. This test is our toughest one, so a 99th percentile of 36.5 FPS means you can expect smooth performance across the board at 1440p as usual. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is another good game for AMD. For instance, the 2070 Super is only 3.5% ahead here, but overall it is 5.5%. Differences between the partner cards continue to be small. Technically, the Nitro Plus card is faster by 1% overall, but the two trade places depending on the game, and this is not a difference that should concern you. The Division 2 is more Nvidia friendly, as you can see by the 2060 Super results here. Still, the card is above 60 FPS throughout the benchmark, and compared to the 2060 Super founders, it has a 10.5% lead across all our benchmarks, but this drops to 5.5% when you compare it to a decent overclocked version like Gigabyte's. Total War 3 Kingdoms is even more Nvidia friendly, and here the 2060 Super OC card overtakes PowerColor. This is also where the card gets its lowest average frame rate. As ever, you should seek out benchmarks for the specific games if you have a strong preference. The last card worth comparing to is the reference RX 5700, and this card is 15% faster across the board than that lower AMD card. System power consumption is as expected, with PowerColor on par with the Sapphire Nitro Plus. This is very high and roughly equivalent to what we see with a 2080 Ti founders, but that's just what happens when you overclock Navi. The Silent BIOS mode makes things much more efficient, so that's a good thing if that's something that concerns you. Thermal performance on this card is truly excellent. The default target temperature is around 65 degrees, making it the coolest card and giving it the best difference over ambient. Performance is similar to MSI's Evoke OC, but PowerColor is way quieter, has the best VRM cooling we've seen so far, and the joint best memory cooling with Sapphire's Nitro Plus. In terms of noise, it's hard to tell the Sapphire and PowerColor apart. Both are way quieter than the reference and quieter than any of the other partner cards we've seen. The Silent BIOS lets things run a tad hotter, which massively benefits the fan speed. It's seriously whisper quiet in this mode, making it a better implemented version than you get on the Nitro Plus. The VRM and memory temperatures are still perfectly healthy. To overclock, we added 50% to the power limit and managed to set the peak of the curve in Wattman to 2100 MHz. We also maxed out the memory to 950 MHz or 15.2 gigabits per second. The card was then able to boost to just over 2000 MHz in-game, and we added 3 to 5% more performance depending on the benchmark. Rankings here are pretty irrelevant since they're based on single samples, and the silicon lottery is the biggest factor. Really, if you want to be overclocking, you need to raise the power limit, so it's more important to focus on getting a card with a cooler that can handle doing this, just like this one. Temperatures and fan speeds when overclocked were all healthy and tolerable. So to wrap up, unsurprising, but it does look like we have another excellent version of the RX 5700 XT in the PowerColor Red Devil. Versus the Sapphire card that we just looked at, there's really not much between them. I mean, they're very similar size, very similar feature set, same price and the same warranty, so it's really going to come down to very individual preferences. Now, our testing does suggest that PowerColor's cooler is slightly better overall when you factor in everything, but really there's very little in it. You might also argue that the silent BIOS is better implemented by dint of being more conservative, but on the other hand, it does dip below reference performance in our tests, so you could argue it both ways. Now, of course, it is worth mentioning that neither the PowerColor nor the Sapphire card is going to be able to do real-time ray tracing in games, which is still exclusive to the Nvidia RTX family. Now, it's really hard to quantify the value of this. It really depends on how much you value the games that it is in or is coming to, but I still think it's worth thinking about, especially if you're not going to be upgrading for a few years, because it's likely to start coming into more and more games. At least that's the pattern, even if it is quite slow. But as it stands at the £450 price point, we reckon that this or the Sapphire Nitro Plus are your best bets. They stack up nicely between the 2060 Super and 2070 Super in terms of price performance, so really we recommend just choosing which you prefer based on looks or whatever other factor is important to you. As ever, remember to head over to the website if you want to see more graphs, more analysis and so on, and you can also keep up with us on social media. But until then, don't forget to hit subscribe, leave us a comment with your feedback, and I will see you next time.